your mics once you join, please. Thank you. So we deal with various stakeholders, be it pre-contracting, within the contracting stage, and also post-contracting. Even as a business, it's also important that you understand what your stakeholder needs are so that you can create value for them. So this evening, what we are hoping to do after this meeting, objective would be to be equipped with tools and some wisdom that we can immediately go back to our businesses and workplaces to deploy. How are we able to demonstrate to stakeholders? How are we able to demonstrate even within the C-suite? How are we able to demonstrate in the boardrooms? There've been a huge cry about some accountants taking on the jobs of procurement professionals. I'd say that it's also a blessing in disguise, because now we have the opportunity to demonstrate value to them, not just to the accountant, but also to business, that procurement is beyond buying. So essentially what we want to do this evening is to see how we can glean wisdom from this process, which is stakeholder management. How can we manage it effectively and then communicate the value that we bring on board? And to help us do that, we have very seasoned procurement professionals who have many years of experience spanning local and multinational organizations. We have diverse experiences, also public and private institutions, and they'll be sharing a lot of wisdom with us, very practical examples, so that we can go back to our various businesses and deliver the value that's needed. Also, even if you are not a practicing professional, but you're a supplier, we reckon that some people have joined this call so that they can also learn and be equipped. It will be good for you, because even if you're a supplier, you also get to deal with some stakeholders. So welcome everyone. And at this resource persons. The first one is Mrs. Evelyn Sam, as you can see on your screens. Evelyn Sam has over 30 years working experience with 25 years in supply chain management across different industries in the United Kingdom and in Ghana. She is currently the Chief Supply Chain Officer of Airtel Tigo. Prior to this, she worked as the head of supply chain in MTN Ghana Limited for 9 years and was the company's planning manager for Unilever Ghana for 11 years. And she is also the council chair for GIBS. Welcome, Madam Chair. The second resource person is Nana Mapia. She is an FSIPS qualified chartered procurement leader, an ISO 27001 IEC certified lead implementer, an ISO 27035 lead incident manager with a legal background and extensive experience in banking and utilities in the UK and across Africa. Nanama's contribution to the procurement profession has been recognized by the business executives at both African and Ghanaian Feminine Achievers Awards, as well as Industry Personality and Procurement Professional of the Year at the Ghana Procurement and Supply Chain Awards. She is also recognized by the Ghana Procurement and Supply Chain Awarding Body as one of the top 20 leaders in the country. Mentoring young procurement professionals is one of her passions and was part of the Springboard Mentoring Program in 2021 and 2022. With a track record for successfully reducing organizational spend, establishing procurement functions, and strengthening supply chains in alignment with business objectives, she is currently a senior project manager at Zenith Bank UK Limited, where she is working on automating the procure to pay process and open banking implementation. Her previous roles include Head General Services and Procurement, Zenith Bank Ghana, Head of Procurement, UMB Bank Ghana, as well as Stanbic Bank Ghana and Standard Bank South Africa, where she was most noted for her contribution to the Rest of Africa Transformation Project for procurement managers across the group. Nanama attributes her achievements in life to the grace of God. Welcome, Madam Nanama Apia.
Thank you, Celestine. Good evening.
Good evening. Our final resource person is Madam Alice Zu. Alice is the Chief Procurement and Supply Chain Manager at the Ministry of Information, President, Procurement and Supply Management Association, PROSMA. She holds MSIPs from Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply Management from London, UK, since 2010. She holds an executive master's in strategic and project management from Paris Graduate School, Paris, France, bachelor's degree accounting from Central University, an HND in purchasing and supply from Koforidua Technical University, formerly Koforidua Polytechnic. Welcome, Madam Alice Zu.
Thank you, Celestine. I'm grateful.
Right, we'll go straight into it. And as part of the ground rules, let me just give you a bit of outline and how this webinar is going to flow. So we'll take presentations from our first, second, and third resource persons. After that, we'll zoom in straight into Q&A sessions. As much as possible, we advise that if you have questions you like answers to, you can use the chat session where you can drop in your comments, questions in advance so that we can ask our resource person and they will address them for you. So without much ado, I'd like to call our first speaker, who would be Madam Evelyn Sam, to take the floor.
Hello, good evening. A very warm welcome to all of you and to our panel members as well and our President Simon. I'm expecting this to be a very interactive session. We'll quickly present and you can ask all the questions. I'm going to keep it very simple. Can we move to the next slide, please? Okay, so I like to add bits of cartoon to my presentations. And this one here is saying getting everyone on board. If we look at our personal lives, how do we think we can move on if you're doing something and you leave some people out? So in this depiction of a cartoon is showing a group of people, a policeman and various people, ordinary people, and the dog or the cow. I think there's a cow has been left out. And he's saying that I'm a stakeholder too. I think we realize in our day-to-day lives that we need a collaboration from everyone when you're doing something. If you're doing a project, for example, and you have team members, you need everyone to be on board. And to get them on board, you need to communicate well. And that's the only way to achieve good results in any project you do. So we'll define stakeholder in the next slide and explain why stakeholder management is very important. Okay, so we all stakeholders. Everyone is a stakeholder because we belong to a church, a community. We work. You are partners. You have friends. So everybody is a stakeholder. So the definition here is saying a stakeholder is any person, a group or organization that's impacted by one action or the other. And like I mentioned in the cartoon, I mean, we all get impacted by anyone we interact with. So any one of us is a stakeholder. And moving from that, if we look at stakeholder management, then we go now to the process. So we're looking at the process by which, so in this context, we're looking at work environment, okay? So we've zoomed it into our various work environments, how stakeholder management works in there for key successes in our roles. So it's saying that stakeholder management is a process by which you organize, monitor, and improve your relationships with your stakeholders. So whilst you yourself are a stakeholder, you're going to now monitor and improve your relationship with another person. So the other people are also stakeholders. And it involves systematically identifying the stakeholders. So we'll go to a slide that shows how to identify a stakeholder. So you have to identify the stakeholders and analyze their needs. So if I give a simple example of you living in a community, for example, and you all need water to flow, you need the roads to be done. The needs of the stakeholder, you being a resident in that area, you need your needs to be met. So whoever the leader of the community association is has to identify your needs. So they are stakeholders and you're also stakeholders. So if we carry on with the definition, it says to analyze the needs and expectations, because there are expectations, planning and implementation of various tasks to engage with them. So you need to identify and see how you can implement the successes to resolve issues. So we looked at the definition of who a stakeholder is. We've also looked at what stakeholder management is. So those two are quite critical in knowing how to move around and to have successful stakeholder management. But why is it important? I mean, why don't we just carry on our lives without bothering about stakeholder management? It's very key to all operations. And because it helps us to identify and understand the needs of everyone. Okay, so we'll look at the category of stakeholders. So you understand the need of expectations of the key stakeholders, okay? It's to develop and implement strategies. So after you've identified the needs, how best to resolve the needs of these stakeholders. And the last one is it helps businesses. So in the context of which we are here, it helps businesses to build and maintain strong relationships with their stakeholders. And we'll come to why in businesses you need to have strong relationships with your stakeholders. Next slide, please. So now this is looking at the four main key stakeholders. And this, again, is in the context of a company. I mean, I'm sure there are different types of stakeholders in different situations. So assuming there's a company, if you're looking at maybe Facebook or something like that, or you're looking at a company that has been acquired, for example, there'll be investors, and the investors are the ones who put money into the business. So they are going to have some thoughts. So if I put in X amount of money, what am I going to get in return? Similarly, the employees who are working, who are putting the time and effort, coming into work, working late hours, doing presentation, are also going to have expectations. Now, so if there's a company, for example, producing shoes, and someone has invested money for the machines, for example, the leather for the shoes, and the employees working there, there'll also be customers, because who is going to buy the products? It's going to be customers who are going to buy the product to bring in the revenue. And then finally, there'll be suppliers. So the people who are going to supply the various things, whether it's laces, the leather, boxes. So this is just four simple stakeholders. So in a simple environment, I've tried to depict, it's just looking at someone who's invested money, who expect returns, those who are working, those who are purchasing the product, and obviously those who are supplying. So these are four key stakeholders. And they all will have needs. And the needs of all these people will be different because everybody has a different type of need. Okay, next slide, please. In all of this, and I think in life, we realize that communication is very key. We communicate in different ways. We communicate through presentation, we communicate through emails, we communicate verbally as well. But communication is key and runs through all the four key stakeholders I mentioned. Because if you don't communicate, how do you get your points across? How do you know what the needs of the people are? How do you inform the people? So again, let's go again to the example of an association in any political region, manual managed housing, Paraku housing. So you have an association and they meet and people are paying dues. Are we just going to collect the dues and just keep the money? You have to communicate. You have to be accountable. You have to say, we've got X amount of money. If people say that our taps are not running, someone will have to take the lead and communicate, what are we going to do about it? You know, so it has to be a two-way communication, and communication is very key. Because sometimes people have the information, but they haven't shared what the information is. So how would the other end know? So it's very important that in managing stakeholders, communication runs through all the various types of stakeholders. So we said that it's a proven way to keep the crucial stakeholders on board. Because if you don't keep them on board, they just drift away. And it's by keeping good relationships with them. Also, it's respectful to also communicate. And this has a big impact on the organization. And communicating is just not communicating anyhow, but it's in the right way. We all know what the right way is. We don't have to define the right way of communicating. It has to be polite, it has to be effective, it has to have the right content. So the person who is at the receiving end, or the company or the individuals at the other end, can accept the communication in a very good way. Okay, so my last slide is, okay, so the last one looks at the 4 steps before I hand over to Nanama to ably carry on. So like I mentioned, in any situation, so assuming you are a business owner, you are an investor, or you're running anything that you want to do, what do you have to do first? You have to identify them. The first stage is to identify them. Who are your stakeholders? Okay, and then after that, you have to document each stakeholder's role. So what is one person supposed to do? What's the other person supposed to do? So even in our procurement and our supply chain environments, we have contracts with vendors and our suppliers. You need to itemize what they need to do. Do you have service level agreements? Have you itemized the various steps that they need to do to be able to achieve what you want them to do? So after identifying the stakeholders, you also have to document each stakeholder's role. That's the way to be accountable. Then you can measure how well they are doing. Then you need to prioritize the stakeholders as well. Are you going to prioritize based on Pareto? Are you going to look at the 20% who are giving you 80% of your revenue, or the ones who are critical? So for those of us who are in a telco environment, how do we determine who is more important? Is this the scratch card vendor? Is this the SIM card vendor? Is it the network vendor? So you need to be able to prioritize and focus on the key people who can make or break the business. And finally, develop a communication plan for all the stakeholders. So you can either do weekly communication. Some people do newsletters. Some people do emails. Some people do monthly meetings. So whatever it is, like I said in the last but one slide, communication is key in all management of stakeholders. Okay, so on that note, I'll hand over to Nanama. Thank you.
Thank you, Evelyn. Grateful. Okay, good evening, everyone. Evelyn has been absolutely brilliant in giving her presentation. I hope you can see me a little bit better. Good. Okay, so let's talk about stakeholder identification. Now, Evelyn explained in the beginning that you have different types of stakeholders. So I'm going to look at it from the point where you have internal stakeholders and external stakeholders. It's important that you always understand who your stakeholders are. You start a project, or you start a procurement process, or you start something. The first thing you need to do is identify who they are. Now, how would you identify them? Who's interested in this project? Who's interested in this procurement? Who is the sponsor of the project or the procurement? Who is the key stakeholder in there? Who wrote the business case? Who signed the business case? Who was it presented to? Who's the ESCO member who's actually chairing this? Who are the customers? Who's going to benefit? All those people are your stakeholders. If you're doing a project and, okay, take it, you work in catering and you have a project or a tender that you're doing, you have to look at the external stakeholders in this. So you've got public authorities, you've got regulators. So for catering, you'd be looking at the Food and Drug Authority. For banking, you'd be looking at you look at BOG, Bank of Ghana. They're your regulator, so they're definitely your stakeholder. And if you're in telecoms, you'd be looking at the NCA. So it's important that as you identify the stakeholders, you put them into the right categories as well. And as we go on in the slides, I'll explain the way we categorize them. But it's important that for the first part, you know who they are. You put them into your box, and then we look at how we communicate with them and we deal with them. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Okay, so this is just looking at the stakeholder management as a full process. So I've already talked about identifying the stakeholder. Evelyn talked about that as well. She also mentioned the communication. But in the whole process, what you do first is you'd identify, you'd analyze and communicate, and then you put together an engagement plan for them. Very, very important. If you don't manage your stakeholders well, it affects your whole process, it affects your project, and it affects your relationship going forward. So can we move on to the next slide? Because this is just explaining the whole process together. Right, this is my favorite slide. because it tells us how we analyze our stakeholders and we communicate with our stakeholders. I know the age of 4-box models has moved on. I'm not going to show my age by still using a 4-box model, but I believe that there's a place and time for everything. And I believe 4-box models are still very, very acceptable. So don't ask me my age in the questions, but I'm still using this one. So stakeholder analysis and communication. We have different types of stakeholders. Stakeholders in terms of their influence, and we look at the power that they have, yes, and the interest as well that they have. So we look at influence and power, and we look at their interest. So take the first box, keeping a stakeholder satisfied. This is a type of stakeholder that is highly influential, that has a low interest in what you're doing. How do we deal with them? How would we communicate with them? We're supposed to meet their need. Now, who would you put in that box? So as part of your stakeholder management, you have to take a look at the different stakeholders you have, and you put them into these boxes. Now, I would say if it was my process, and I'm in banking, so if it was my process and I was looking for my keep satisfied stakeholder, I would definitely, depending on the project that I'm working on, put my CFO first. Why? Because at the end of the day, with almost all of us, whatever project you're working on, who's going to sign that paper for you? If it's not the CFO, then who's it going to be? So I would definitely put my CFO into the keep satisfied box. And what am I supposed to do? Whatever they ask for at the outset of the project, provide it. What would you do to keep them informed of what is going on? Consult them when necessary, and then you call them when necessary. So that's the first box of keep satisfied. Now let's look at the next box, manage closely. Now these are your key players in every project that you work on. So for me, who would I have in this? For me, it would definitely have to be somebody like your chief operating officer, the person who's directly interested in that project that you've put out or that tender that you're doing. So for the manage closely box, this is where you would put somebody like your chief information officer, if it's an IT project you're working on, because in this box, you're dealing with the key players. These are people who are highly influential. They have a lot of power where your project or your procurement is concerned, and they are very interested in everything you do. This box also covers people like your actual user, and this is the user who requested the requirement or the service. So that person would be part of that box because they're ones that have to be involved throughout the life cycle of that procurement process. You could put people like the project manager for that procurement process as well, because the project manager will be part of that whole process as well. So they have to be managed closely and they're key players. You would then also talk about people like internal control, depending on where you work. They would be key players. It's for you to look at all your different stakeholders and see which ones are the ones that you need to bring close and which ones that you need to put into the various boxes. So the first two boxes, keep satisfied and manage closely. These are places where you put C-level management type stakeholders. So obviously chief of everything. Then we get to the lower boxes. The first one I'll talk about is the keep informed box. So these are stakeholders who don't have a lot of power, but they still have a lot of interest in what you're doing. So this could be somebody like if you are running any project, it's definitely your consultant who's part of the project. They don't have a lot of power, but you have to keep them, they have interest, you have to keep them informed of what is going on. You show them consideration because they are important to the process, but they can't break your process. They could cause some challenges, but they can't break a process. So you have your consultants, you have contractors, you have suppliers. You also have some end users in the organization. So these are end users who maybe are not involved in the process, but they will benefit from whatever you're putting out. So typical example, if you're putting in maybe a new system that's going to help your salespeople go out and sell using some device. The salesperson out there is not the sort of person that you need to keep involved in the whole process. But of course, you need to keep them informed because they're the ones who will be out there dealing with your customers. So they need to know what is going on throughout the process. And you need to take into consideration their advice or their interest because they're key to what you do. The last box is the one sometimes referred to as least important, but I prefer to refer to them as minimal contact or the ones that you monitor. So these are the stakeholders like the operations team. So you're running a process, you have operations. Now, they're not impacting your process, but at some point, what they do will affect your whole system that you're putting in place or whatever you're purchasing. So you keep people like sales staff, operations staff, they are the ones you put into that box. They have low influence, they have low interest, but you need to monitor them and make sure that they are aware of everything you're doing in the process. And also how you communicate with them is usually not on a day-to-day, but whatever you do in your project, you inform them so they're also aware and they can take it out there. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So my final slide is on stakeholder engagement. And Evelyn made it very abundantly clear that that's one of the most important areas in terms of communication and keeping your stakeholders involved in the process throughout the management of your project. So how would you do that? First thing, keep them involved. You must always respect the roles of each stakeholder in your process. You have to build relationships with them. They could be either blockers or they could be helpers. So your aim is to move every blocker into the position of being a helper or somebody who sponsors or encourages what you're doing. So find new participants and always encourage dialogue between them. Encourage their involvement. How do you do that? Any idea that is brought, do not dismiss it. Go through it, discuss, allow them to get involved. Stakeholders like engagement often, depending on which stakeholder we're looking at. Remember, we talked about the key ones and the ones that are not key. So make sure the key ones are always involved in your constant meetings, whether it's weekly, bi-weekly. Make sure they're involved throughout the process so that nothing comes up they're not aware of. Now, being candid with them. Always consider every issue they bring forward. Build trust. Create an environment where everybody's opinion is welcome. So know that, as we say when you're having meetings, no question is a bad question or is a stupid question. You never know, somebody might raise something that we haven't thought about. So even the end user who might have given you everything, but they raise somewhere along the line, oh, did you know that our customers don't like it now when we bring out information and we don't put pamphlets behind it? You might think it's not important, but actually that's a key thing because they are the customer facing ones. So you take that into consideration and you see how it's going to impact the project that you're working on. Relevance. Make every information you provide to them relevant. Focus on issues of greatest importance to them. If the finance manager wants to know how the budget is going, make sure you're informing them how the budget is moving on. If you're going out of budget, make sure he's aware because he has to be consulted. So if you have an issue coming up, I'm currently working on a project. For some reason, the project has gone out of budget. But what we did was we conditioned the people involved, put it that way, our key players and our key satisfied players very, very early on, letting them know that because of some changes that we'd made to the project, our budget was going to move a little bit. And we started conditioning them way before it actually got to the point that we actually needed to take the paper before them. So by the time we went, because we had shared everything with them, because we had disclosed all the information, everything had been put before them. It got through very, very quickly. So it's important to be very candid with them. Now, relevance. Share knowledge. Provide access to all the information you're working on. Be timely with what you provide as well. When engaging them, make sure that you can influence decisions and actions, and that comes to conditioning. This is not a presentation on conditioning, but in everything you're doing with stakeholders and working with them, it's important that you condition stakeholders. And conditioning is being honest, providing them with information right from the start, let them understand what you're doing, let them know that this is how long it's going to take. Do not overpromise and underdeliver. Best to underpromise and overdeliver. Always a good one, but usually just try and be straightforward with them. Learning is my next point. Seek mutual understanding every single time in your projects. Make sure that the solution does not benefit just one party, but even if you're considering your regulator, what does the regulator want out of this? So in our industry, the regulator is always interested in, at the moment, our biggest thing is cybersecurity. So everything we're doing, we have to make sure that we've taken that into consideration. We cannot leave it out. Are we meeting all our requirements in terms of cybersecurity? Every project we do, we have to show that there's some sort of benefit in there, and we're following the rules of cybersecurity and the directives that have been given by the regulator. Focus on the future. Emphasize what we can do. So if you have a project and the project is for 2 years, what's going to happen afterwards? Are you moving on to a higher form of IT equipment? Is the bank going in a different direction? How scalable is what you're doing? That's also important. Focus on all the future benefits to the stakeholders going with the plan that you put forward. And lastly, action. Act on results. Apply learning to improve every business process and decision that you're making. And make sure that you provide evidence. Show the stakeholders the results, how the results will be used. Show the stakeholders how the benefits will help the organization. We're talking about adding value. It's not worth going to your CEO and putting in place some what typical example. So you go to your stakeholder and you want to put in place a new system for banking, put it that way. You're putting in a system for banking that deals with paper-based banking. Nobody's going to be interested in that. What they'll be interested in is, at the moment, what is everybody doing? We're interested in web banking. We're interested in mobile banking. So if you're putting in a system where people still have to go to the bank and fill in withdrawal sheets, nobody's going to be interested in that. So there has to be some evidence of what is going to benefit the stakeholders going forward, how the results will be used. It's going to be, oh, we're going to reduce customer waiting time in the banking hall if we put in this web banking, because less people will come into the banks. That's benefit, that's action, that's future relevance. So that's my addition to this presentation, and hopefully you will have questions for me later on. Thank you very much, Celestine. I believe we move on to Alice now.
Madam Alice, the floor is yours.
Hello, good evening. Thank you, Madam Evelyn, and thank you, Auntie Ama and Nanama. I'm coming from the perspective of procurement and supply chain management from the civil service perspective, how we handle and manage our suppliers, our service providers, and our clients as stakeholders. In civil service, can we move to the next slide, please? In civil service, we have various stakeholders that we deal with in the chain as procurement professionals. And with the various stakeholders, as my previous presenters have analyzed already, we, in our perspective, our stakeholders are various organizations spanning from government, individuals, groups as suppliers, the political head. These various stakeholders, they impact in how and why government business should operate. The various type of stakeholders in the procurement profession and civil service, if we can move to the next slide, we have government, we have our CEOs, we have our chief directors, we have our political heads, that is the honorable ministers for various government ministries, departments, and agencies, local governments. We have the suppliers themselves. We have service providers, technical consultancy. We have individuals who are also investors in government business, who are also stakeholders. When it comes to these, you look at it, government business thrives in an environment that we term and call communities. So these communities also have interest, like Nanama rightly stated out. When it comes to our stakeholders, if you take, when it comes to finances of projects, is government and Ministry of Finance. You have our chief executives because they are the spending officers or managers of our pairs. In the other jurisdiction, they are the chief executive officers. We have our chief directors, we have our employees who work in the various ministries, departments, and agencies. We have user department. If we are going to procure, first and foremost, we prepare procurement plans. If the procurement plans, there are no financiers from government business, it's Ministry of Finance and other donor agencies that handle most of the financing of government projects and then Ministry of Finance. So if there's no financing agency, even when you prepare your procurement plan, it won't fly. And then our biggest, who is Public Procurement Authority, is also a very key stakeholder as far as government procurement is concerned. Then we have our customers, we have our suppliers, we have consultants, we have other service providers that make sure that government agenda is achieved through procurement in the supply chain. Now, can we proceed? So dealing with some of these, some of service providers and stakeholders in our chain of command can be a bit tough and challenging when it comes to satisfying their needs, getting them to be okay with their interests. Like Nanama pointed in the 4 quadrants, some have high interest. Their stake in the investment or the business that government is doing. Some have great decision-making that can influence either the procurement process going through or not going through. Some are also business organizations that when they invest their funds, they have interest because they want to see to it that the investment doesn't go in. And then the organization itself, and then all these various stakeholders, how do we relate, communicate, handle them at the various 4 quadrants, especially when it comes to our honorable ministers, our sector ministers, our deputy ministers, our chief executive officers, our chief directors, our directors, our head of departments, our employees, our user department. How do we handle all these people? That is within the internal stakeholders as stakeholders in government business. We also have external stakeholders. Like Nanama rightly said, we have government as government plays both internal and external stakeholder role. Ministry of Finance is an external stakeholder. Some of the suppliers, the technical service providers as external stakeholders. PPA is our regulator, but it's an external stakeholder. We take auditors. Auditors, internal auditors are internal stakeholders and external auditors. To us in government operations as procurement professionals, they are external stakeholders. We have the bank, our financiers, we have customers, we have media houses, we have transport, which is key, which is also an external stakeholder. We have internet service providers. Actually, if not for the internet, this Zoom wouldn't have been possible. It's a key stakeholder in procurement activities. We have society where the services are provided. Let's take an example. If you are providing a government project, let's say developing a port or an inland port anywhere outside Greater Accra, the society where the inland port or the harbor will be taking place will have an interest and is a key stakeholder that has to be satisfied in the provision of those service from government to the community. We also have creditors, lenders for external stakeholders. Nana, can we continue? So some of the challenges, procurement professionals, if I'm speaking on behalf of all my colleagues from the civil service and government agencies, one of the key challenges we encounter is, because of the high interest, high power, low influence, low power, interest, high interest, low influence, how to handle all the various stakeholders in the chain to make sure that we get procurement effectively done can be very challenging. One of it is that when procurement professionals, we stand in for our activities, and the procurement activity, let's take one of these examples. One, in your procurement plan, there's no procurement activity, but the top hierarchy comes and say, oh, undertake this procurement activity. One, that procurement activity is not in your plan, it's not being approved. Two, there's no financing for it, and they are pushing that it should be executed. Some of the places when our team, our colleagues from the procurement profession stand and say, please, my honorable bosses, this is not in our plan, it's not being captured, there's no finance for it, and you stand in the way. And if you stand to try to explain and don't get the buy-in from the top class who have the high influence and high interest, hey, believe you me, some of my colleagues at the place, if some will confirm, end up suffering, and it can result being moved or something, just to have that government official or that top person in place have his way. We also have another challenge, which is delay in procurement. Contracts are executed when contracts are signed. Yes, two parties sign the contract. The contractor has executed the contract. It's time for government or the agency or department that has signed the contract to pay. There's so much delay in release of funds for payment of contracts that is executed. And this one delay in a release of funds for the payment in the procurement and supply chain, one increases cost overruns in projects. That is why you have so many government abandoned projects that are not completed. You have service providers coming back to request for increase in the cost before those projects will be completed. And we also have non-release of funds from Ministry of Finance for projects that has been executed. One, there's a project that procurement, there's a procurement plan that covers it, there's a warrant, but once the execution of the project is completed, release of funds, some of them don't come. And it gives a lot of stress to procurement professionals in the service. That makes our work a bit difficult, and also make it difficult for us to even some of the service providers, when you get back to them in your database to get work executed, though they are in your database, but because of delayed payments, there's a lot of backlog of non-paid bills. They are not ready to get projects or assignment executed for ministries, departments, and agencies. Can we continue? Yes, so solutions to these problems are challenges. One, we propose that first and foremost, we must do effective communication. My first speaker spoke about it, my second speaker spoke about it, and from the public perspective, I'm also speaking about it. We must ensure that we have, once we identify our stakeholders, we do effective communication with them to know the project, the source of funding, and when we insert clauses for payment, we should make sure that, yes, government business, there's this saying that no service provider or supplier can take government to court, but it also puts us, the procurement professionals, in a tight corner because some of them, they write and legal people bring a request and it's like, we should speak to it, to our bosses. And then there should also be that collaboration between procurement and all stakeholders in the supply chain, doing stakeholder engagement, open forums, meetings, mails, to communicate, to let that the service providers who are going to undertake a project or an assignment in your ministry, department, or agency know that, yes, there's this source of funding, but there might be a delay. And due to that, the service provider will get prepared and also make sure that whatever contract sum he's quoting, at least there's a look into it, and then they wouldn't come back asking for contract sum reviews, as we are seeing now, because some of the contracts are done over 1 year, 2 years, they've not been paid. Suppliers feel that the price they quoted and now the new price in the market, when we pay them the old rate of one, they can't get the value for their money. 3, we should ensure that specific warrant from finance, Ministry of Finance, is what is implemented in procurement. We don't get a specific warrant for the procurement of, let's say, vehicles or ties, and that is used, that warrant, that fund is used for another thing. In the accounting balances, they will say that they did virement, but to us, procurement is not a good practice. So we should always stick to the activity that funds are approved of. Even requests for quotations, that if you don't get approval, please, team, if you don't get approval from the top that have the high influence, like your chief director, your honorable minister, your deputy minister, your finance directorate, even if it's in your plan, if you don't get the approval to commence that procurement, once you send the request with a copy of your procurement plan and they say, please, there's no funds or keep in view, please, let's take to keep in view so that we don't get procurement done and funds are not available to get payments done. And then we always have this stress. Suppliers are coming on you. And at times it's like, at some of them, it's difficult for you to even explain. And at that critical point, please, sorry to say it as it is, some of our top people are not ready to meet some of these service providers or suppliers or customers. And it becomes a big albatross on procurement professionals' neck. So please, let's embrace this. And in the civil service, the procurement professionals will be a bit relieved in handling our procurement activities. So in conclusion, stakeholder management is very crucial in every procurement activity in the value chain to ensure the delivery of value for money. Why do I say so? Once stakeholders, we manage our stakeholders effectively, we make sure that they are satisfied with all the conditions we provide. They also make sure they execute the part of the contract is completed on time. we will make sure that we'll make some savings from contracts that is being executed. We'll get value because if it's completed on time, they wouldn't be reducing the quality of the product to be done or to be delivered. And they will also pay on time. So we'll get value for money and all parties will be satisfied. So let's manage our various stakeholders efficiently at every level of the supply chain, from downstream to the upstream, to ensure both internal and external stakeholders are always satisfied in the delivery of service, be it goods, service, or technical service to the development of our mother Ghana. Thank you and God bless us all. I'll be on standby for questions, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Alice. Thank you, Nana Mapia, and thank you, Madam Evelyn Sam. I think it's been very insightful so far. I've learned some new things. I have some perspective on what my colleagues within the government sector go through, and it's been very insightful. Thank you very much, Madam Alice Zhu.